Thank you so much for having me today to share about the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience located in New Orleans, Louisiana. Um, I'm just thrilled to get to share a little bit about the museum. I always like to start these tours with a little bit of housekeeping because we're going to go on a literal tour of our galleries. In just a moment, after I do a little bit of an introduction, I'm going to turn the camera around, and instead of seeing my face, you're going to see our gallery walls. Um, and just like you would be if you had a museum, if you at a museum, you get to see the whole space, but you also want to zoom in on those objects. So I'm going to have the same PowerPoint up that you can see. So what you can do is choose if you want to see the big picture of the museum big to a bigger device, an iPad or a tablet or a computer. You can drag the two lines you'll see that are my video out, and I'll make it bigger. Um, and then you'll see a bigger version of the gallery. Or if you want to see the objects closer up, you'll go the other way and you'll see those objects on the PowerPoint instead. If you're looking at whatever device you joined on and you're not seeing that option, completely fine. Whether you're only in the gallery or only seeing the PowerPoint, you're going to get the full story. And then the other little bits is questions. I really encourage folks to ask questions. We're going to go through about 300 plus years of Southern Jewish experience. So I would hate for you to have a question in the 1700s and we get to the 21st century and you forgot what that question was. So please use that question option. And I'll be answering them at the end. But before we really get started, I'm here to enrich your knowledge of Southern Jewish history. But some of us might come with some of our own Southern Jewish history. So we're going to do a little bit of trivia. And just like if you're playing Jeopardy at home, I encourage folks to yell your answer. I won't be able to hear it, just like the host of Jeopardy can't, but yell your answer at the screen. So my first question. Which city had the first synagogue outside of the original 13 colonies? Got to think, was it A, Savannah, B, Mobile, or C, New Orleans? I'm going to give everybody a moment to to think, maybe yell at your screen. And the answer to that question is New Orleans. This one's tricky because I said the original 13 colonies. What is now known as Touro Synagogue was founded in 1828 here in New Orleans, just 25 years after the Louisiana Purchase. Touro Synagogue's congregation resulted from a union between two original congregations, Congregation Gates of Mercy and Congregations Dispersed of Judah, and it became Shancharei Chesed Gates of Mercy, and that was founded in 1828. And it was later renamed Touro Synagogue after the merchant philanthropist Judah Touro, son of Isaac Touro, leader of the Rhode Island Synagogue, that was named for him. So our second question, our second Jeopardy question, which African-American musician was taken in by a Jewish family at the age of 7 and given his first instrument? Was it A, Jelly Roll Morton, B, Louis Armstrong, or C, Buddy Bolton? Put on your musician knowledge. Take it a moment. A, Jelly Roll Morton, B, Louis Armstrong, or C, Buddy Bolton? If you said B, Louis Armstrong, you are correct. The Karnofsky family here in New Orleans employed a young Louis, and he collected refuse like bottles and rags, and helped him buy his first cornet. And Armstrong wore a Star of David necklace around his neck as an expression of gratitude to the Jewish family that helped him as a youngster. So that's a bit about your own Southern Jewish trivia knowledge. I'm here to add more. And let's start with how the museum came to be. So we opened here in New Orleans in May of 2021, but this is not the first iteration of the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. We were originally founded in 1986 at Henry S. Jacobs Camp in Utica, Mississippi, which is a URJ camp. Utica is a small rural town about 45 minutes out of Jackson, Mississippi, which is a wonderful place for summer camp, but not so accessible to folks who want to learn more about Southern Jewish history. Plus, during camp, it was inaccessible, right? Camp was in session, so you couldn't really go visit the collection. So they made a decision in 2012 to officially close the museum at Jacobs, and they searched for a new home. And looking for the museum's new home, a committee of volunteered board members were looking for a place where they could reach the most people, a Southern Jewish city with a lot of tourist traffic, and importantly, a Southern Jewish city that doesn't yet have a Jewish museum. New Orleans was chosen because we are a wonderful place to visit, lots of fun things to do here, including Mardi Gras, which just happened last week. And we didn't have a Jewish museum yet. So since opening in almost 4 years ago, despite the challenges of the COVID pandemic, we've had thousands of guests come through our doors, and our tagline, Shalom, make yourself at home. Shalom, makes yourself at home, underscores our vision for the museum as a place where people can come together and comfortably learn with each other, have conversations, and celebrate Southern Jewish life and contemplate Southern Jewish history. So the museum tells 300 plus years of the Southern Jewish experience, and we work to tell this through a variety of viewpoints. Through bigger historical themes that mirror and reflect the experiences of many Americans throughout these times, throughout these 300 years, the particular stories of place, and individual stories. Southern Jewish history intersects with Southern history and Jewish history, and throughout our galleries, you'll see how these histories are reflected. And whenever possible, we view these bigger themes told through individual stories, through objects, personal narratives, and digital interactives. And we're always looking for more stories to be told. So perhaps you identify as a Southern Jew, maybe your family has Southern Jewish roots. So if you have something in your own personal collection, both archival or a physical object, consider donating it to the museum because we're actively collecting. The themes of our museum and this tour are roughly chronological, but we're working on themes, not timelines. So you're going to notice things that have a through line. For example, we're going to start with immigration, how and why Jews came to the American South, starting first with port cities and then what drew them into the interior of the country. However, we know that Jews continually immigrated and continue to immigrate to the South. So while we're starting our museum story in that, it's not the end of the conversation. Okay, we've grounded ourselves in why the museum is here, roughly what we're doing. Now let's pull away to our timeline and get started on our tour. And this is where I'm going to go ahead and flip my camera around so that you're going to see the inside of our galleries. So you're looking at a timeline. And we start in 1585 with the first Jewish person who came to colonial America. His name was Joachim Gans, and he came to the Virginia colony on Sir Walter Raleigh's expedition, and he was a metallurgist and a mining engineer. And 1654, the first Jewish people to settle in colonial America did so in New Amsterdam, more than 50 years later. So we like to say that the history of the Jewish people in the United States started in the American South. Joachim Gans is just one person. The New Amsterdam colony was a community. And that's in part what we're doing here at the museum. We want to make sure we're telling individual stories that highlight and enrich our knowledge of American history. And then 1809, when the galleries were first being designed, we were thinking purposely about ways in which certain perspectives haven't been recorded and focused on in history. Most obviously, those are the stories of Southern Jews, an American Jewish narrative that we tend to focus on a narrative of Northern Jews because there are a lot more Northern Jews than there are Southern Jews. However, there are other Jewish stories that don't get focused on as much, and we're working to bring those stories to the forefront as well. So for example, women's stories. Archives and objects from these time periods certainly skew towards men, and we know that women were active and engaged decision makers and actors at this time. So we're including these stories to enrich our understanding of Southern Jewish experience while also telling important perspectives. So let me tell you about Rachel Mordecai Lazarus, daughter of Jacob Mordecai, which I just learned, not Mordecai, 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 whatever. And he opened the Mordecai Female Seminary in North Carolina in 1809. So this prestigious school taught needlework and dancing alongside subjects often reserved for male pupils, such as mathematics and Latin. Rachel Mordecai Lazarus, served as head instructor of the school, and her close friend and author, and she was close friend and author to author Maria Edgeworth, and she influenced Edgeworth to confront anti-Jewish stereotypes in her writing. A little aside here that I'm really excited to say, tomorrow night at the museum, but virtually, we are hosting a discussion about Rachel Mordecai Lazarus' little sister Emma, who wrote a Confederate diary. So I'll tell you more about that at the end, but there's all these connections between these families in the American South. And then 1893, the National Council of Jewish Women and CJW, which is America's oldest Jewish women's organization, was established. And Hannah Solomon of Illinois founded NCJW to address the lack of Jewish education and professional experiences. But from the start, Southerners held prominent positions in organizations, including Carrie Simon of Alabama and Jeanette Goldberg of Texas. So in these two stories, we're seeing the influence of Southern Jewish women in education, the arts, but they also aren't insulated. They're part of these national Jewish conversations as well. So this is where we'll do this. How did Jews come to the United States? For some of us, we're looking at a map, the early settlers of colonial America. So those earliest Jewish settlers who came to colonial America were Sephardic, with many tracing their heritage to Spain and Portugal before the Spanish Inquisition, and they came by way of Holland, England, and the West Indies. And they settled in port cities in the Caribbean and along the eastern seaboard and worked in trading industries. So we see the earliest Jewish communities forming here. Mikveh Israel in Savannah, Georgia, is one of the oldest operating synagogues today, and they were founded by Sephardic immigrants. While smaller in number, Ashkenazi Jews from Central and Eastern Europe settled in colonial America, and they brought with them different religious and cultural traditions, sometimes resulting in friction. Later, we have a much larger wave of Ashkenazi immigration, of course, where we think of just many more people coming over. But regardless of when these folks came to the United States, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, they felt a push and a pull to come to the US. So for those Sephardic immigrants, like the Portuguese Jews, they were literally pushed out. 1497, they were forced to convert or to leave, but they were also drawn to colonial America because of the promise of economic mobility. Similarly, Ashkenazi Jews, centuries later, were pushed out of Eastern Europe due to pogroms, civil unrest, and lack of opportunity. But they were pulled by the promise of a better life, of reuniting with family who had already come here. And in fact, many of these reasons that entice immigrants at this time, these are reasons that entice many immigrants at this time, regardless of religion. But when we're thinking about these immigrant stories, these big picture narratives, we can lose individuals. And that's what I love so much about museums, is that you can tell individual stories through objects. So take these Shabbat candlesticks, for instance. Someone held these candlesticks in their hands when they left the old country, Latvia in this case, and they identified their need. They needed to take these with them to help them maintain their Jewish identity, to celebrate rest. These particular candlesticks were brought over from Lithuania, I said Latvia, it's Lithuania, by the parents of South Carolina legislator Harriet Hirschfield Kinserling. But they brought them over to the United States, identifying that their religious practice and these candlesticks history were necessary for their new life. And then I think about the things that get saved and passed down, and they end up in our museum, but they also end up at your own homes, and things that we get to pass down to our family. They have these deep personal stories. So I'm going to now roll to our next object, a traveling trunk. And while I roll there, I'd like you to consider your own story. How did your family come to United States? Um, for some people, like the person whose trunk this was, um, they immigrated to the United States. But a lot of us, and some of us immigrated, some of us have always been here. Um, and some of us immigrate through different ports, right? For instance, my family immigrated through Angel Island out in California. Many others came through Ellis Island, but not all. About 10,000 Eastern European immigrants came in through the port of Galveston, Texas, which is how Galveston got its nickname, the Ellis Island of the South. And bringing these Jews in through the port of Galveston was by design. It was not these immigrants looking at a map of the United States and saying, "Huh, looks interesting to go all the way around Florida." No, instead, what happened was there were philanthropists like Jacob Schiff, who is a businessman and a philanthropist, and he was dedicated to helping immigrants go to places that were not New York City, in part because there was growing anti-immigrant sentiment in these high volume landing spots. And people like Jacob Schiff, who had built a business and built a life, wanted to see his fellow his co-religionists be successful, but also did not want to see growing anti-Semitism because of this anti-immigrant sentiment. And so he worked to develop and fund a program in which new immigrants would come in through Galveston and be supported by Jewish organizations, people like Rabbi Henry Cohen. So if you can see the PowerPoint, Rabbi Henry Cohen is this gentleman that I'm circling who's got this flat-brimmed hat in a truly fantastic mustache. Rabbi Cohen would meet these new immigrants on the docks. And I'd like to imagine that he would ask them how they're doing, how they're feeling, and then ask them, what did you do in the old country? What were some of the things that you did? And some of them might have said, I am a butcher, I'm a shoemaker, I'm a rabbi. And then Rabbi Cohen would try to connect those folks with jobs in the interior of the country. So I imagine he came back after a month or so and said, the butcher, Oklahoma City needs a butcher. Why don't you get on a train? Here's money to get on a train with your family, go to Oklahoma City, be a butcher. And so a fair number of Jews in the West and Midwest can trace their story through the port of Galveston. This trunk, right? I talked about individual stories. This trunk was brought in 1905 through Galveston with Rothmail, who later went by Robert Shapiro. And he immigrated to the United States in search of political freedom and to avoid conscription into the Russian army. Shapiro's journey included secretly crossing the Russian border before gaining passage on a ship departing for Bremen, Germany, and he landed in Galveston, Texas. So Jewish immigration in the 19th century often journeyed beyond port cities like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans, and into the frontiers of Mississippi, Alabama, and Oklahoma. And they often arrived with little to no wealth, and many found workers as peddlers and merchants in the interior of the American South. Advances in railroad transportation, seizure of Native American lands, the clearing of forests and the draining of swamps, and a booming cotton industry built on the labor of enslaved people all led to the founding of these new towns. These outposts, eager for general stores and supplies, often counted themselves among the first residents. As towns grew, Jews found themselves intimately invested in the development of the American South. So now we've established why and how Jews came to the American South. Let's talk about ways in which they made a life here in a section we call Navigating Southern Spaces, which refers literally to getting around, finding a home, and becoming Southern. We focus a lot on diversity and acceptance here at the museum. It's in our mission statement. So I want to talk about that complex identity space that Jews were a part of at this time. This is an opportunity where I'm going to read right from a panel we have at our museum, a museum label, that helps us better understand how Jewish identity was formed in the South in relation to racial hierarchies. Southern Jews' acceptance into white society was conditional and it was complicated. They faced discrimination, as did other ethnic groups, including Italian, Irish, and Asian populations, albeit in varying forms. Nevertheless, Southern Jews benefited from a system that forced African Americans onto the bottom rung of the racial hierarchy. Southern Jews enjoyed opportunities economically, socially, and politically that were unimaginable to African Americans before, during, and after the Civil War. Many Southern Jews turned a blind eye to the racial injustices that benefited them. Others directly contributed to these injustices by owning enslaved people or through supporting a political system that capped African Americans in various forms of enslavement. From here, let's talk about these individual stories. How Jews were interacting with slavery in the pre-Civil War era. We're going to acknowledge it's complicated, and there were a lot of differing perspectives of Southern Jews in the past. But some facts. In the pre-Civil War South, Jews owned enslaved people at the same rate as wider Southern society. In our museum, we have the bill of sale of a young enslaved person. Her name was Harriet. She was sold at age 12 as a slave for life in 1862 to Kara Weisberg of Arkansas. Not only that, but her bill of sale, which is on the left of your PowerPoint screen, was signed in the presence of E.E. Levy, another Jew. So this is an individual story, a person-to-person story of slavery. But we also have the story of Judah P. Benjamin, who, in addition to being the first Jewish person in the United States Senate, he was a senator from my state, Louisiana, and he was also a key Confederate figure. His image is on the right on those $2 Confederate bills. He served as Attorney General, Secretary of War, and Secretary of State for the Confederacy. And we know he was important, right? We only put important people on our money, and he was on the $2 bill for the entirety of the Confederacy. Though we have at our museum the 1862 and 1864 notes. But we also acknowledge that not all Southern Jews were pro-slavery. There were some Southern abolitionists like Moses Elias Levy. So why are we telling these stories? One, it's part of our Southern Jewish experience. Retelling and acknowledging these histories is critical. We cannot shy away from uncomfortable stories or try to tell a singular narrative. I think that a really interesting aspect about museums in general is that they're on the whole a very trusted institution. My joke is always that museums rank just below family and friends, places where we get trusted information, and as you can imagine, scores among politicians. We're places where people trust the things we put on our walls, and we take that role very seriously. We want to build this trust by ensuring that we are telling multiple perspectives from the past and creating an intricate story that is as complex as the present. So there are multiple histories going on here. One is an identity story, and another intertwined is an economic story. How did Southern Jews make a life here in the American South? Before, during, and after the Civil War, Jewish Southerners were also literally navigating the land, working to make a living. One of the most pervasive ideas of the Southern Jewish experience is that of the peddler cart. The peddler went town to town selling his wares, and he was welcomed into these small communities, many of which were too small to have their own general stores. In the peddling experience, we get some really unique stories. For example, in the New Orleans in July 1860, we learn about the daily experiences of peddlers. Things that could have certainly been a challenge for Jewish peddlers. The Crescent reports, quote, that the fare is bacon and bread for breakfast, bacon and bread for dinner, and some bacon and bread for supper. We had bacon on the table and we had bacon under the table, unquote. So, while some peddlers were not religious, others needed to be creative to meet the challenges of observance on the road. Southern Jewish peddlers often set out on Sunday or Monday and returned home by Friday to rest and pray on Shabbat. Where only treif or non-kosher foods like ham and pork seasoned vegetables were available, some Jews carried boiled eggs, while others ate what was served. So even this peddling experience wasn't uniform. Some peddlers, quote unquote, made it. They accrued enough capital to start their own merchant store. And some of those peddlers made it even further, accrued enough capital to open an apartment store. But many other failed and took up a wide range of other work opportunities. Now going to move into a corner of our museum called Votes of Acceptance and an Age-Old Prejudice, where we're exploring both Southern Jewish mayors and stories of anti-Semitism. I'm going to zoom in to zoom out for a second. We're looking at our wall of Southern Jewish mayors, our votes of acceptance. These are two strands of the Southern Jewish life that exist and converse with one another. So the map that you can see, either big or little, shows our 13-state southern region from Texas, Oklahoma, up to Virginia and down to Florida. And it's a map of Southern Jewish mayors. Depending on the color of your screen, the orange dots, perhaps red, are stars that represent towns that have elected one Jewish mayor. And the blue stars are towns that have elected more than one Jewish mayor. And what you'll notice about the distribution of these stars is that there's at least one, I'm trying to think, at least 5 in every state. And they mirror population. So if you're seeing like a big swath of Texas, it's just like not a lot of people live there. Not that that part of Texas doesn't accept Jewish mayors. But we're thinking about how these mayors have become important individuals. These are not towns with incredibly high proportions of Jews in them. Instead, these are places where Southern Jews rose to a level of social importance, have built social capital to be a leader of these towns. They're part and parcel of the community. And so we have these many stories of Jewish acceptances, but we also know that there is a flip side. I'm about to share an image from the Leo Frank story. I would like to let you know it's an effigy of Governor Slanton, but I'd like to let everybody know what they're seeing before they're seeing it. So this is the Leo Frank story, an age-old prejudice, this incredibly potent story of potent episode of anti-Semitism that happened in Georgia. And maybe you're familiar with this story. Leo Frank was a pencil factory superintendent, and he was convicted of the 1913 murder of 13-year-old Mary Fagan. But his sentence was commuted to life in prison. When that happened, a mob broke Frank out of jail and lynched him. So the image you're seeing is an effigy of Slanton, of Governor Slanton. It says, John N. Slanton, King of the Jews. This case was incredibly unsettling for Jews at the time, both Southern Jews and Northern Jews. It led to a variety of organized moves against anti-Semitism. And we tell the story here at the museum in part because it happened in Georgia, but because it adds to our complex understanding of Southern Jewish experiences. We know the South wasn't inhospitable to Jews, but we also know there were times, places where Jewish identity was incredibly fraught. So we're holding those both and stories here at the museum. As we move further into the museum, we talk about how Southern Jews built their Southern Jewish community through securing burial grounds, raising funds for synagogues, establishing schools. And in part, this set Jews apart from their non-Jewish counterparts in that they literally created spaces away for Jewish use. But on the other hand, this is so Southern, so incredibly Southern, that establishing a place of community centered around a religion in America's Bible Belt. So there's so much here that I want to talk about, but I'm going to take this time to talk about this beautiful 1885 crazy quilt. This quilt was made in Canton, Mississippi, stitched by the Sisterhood of Temple B'nai Israel, and it was likely raffled off as a fundraiser to help raise funds to build their synagogue. So that is interesting, right? We have a fundraiser story, something that perhaps other people in this community who are here with us today can identify with. This was a very popular art form. But this points to how this community in Canton, Mississippi, this community in Canton, Mississippi, I just got a notification that my internet's unstable, so if anybody loses me, let me know. But so this community in Canton, Mississippi was part of a wider organization or wider knowledge of what was happening. There were crazy quilts being made all across the United States, but really across the world. And in part, this is a reaction to the prevalence of, so I have this industrial story. The sewing machine allowed people to efficiently sew small, delicate, replicatable stitches super easily. So that type of stitcher was no longer impressive. Instead, being able to showcase your different types of stitches, like the ones you see in a crazy quilt, that becomes impressive. So groups from all over the world would come together and sew quilts like this. So that means that the Sisterhood of Canton, Mississippi was dialed into this popular trend, kind of like the 1880s version of a paint and sip. And here at the museum, we take this story just one step forward, where we ask our visitors to consider the metaphor of stitching themselves into the Southern Jewish community on our digital quilt table. Each of us is unique and identifiable, yet when we come together, we create something new and beautiful. We can focus on an individual story while also getting to see this complicated story of our American experience. It's a very popular stop, and I hope that y'all will make it down here one day to make your own square. We're now going to roll into a part of our museum that I'm going to go a little bit faster through. It's our Foundations of Judaism gallery, where folks who would like to learn more about Judaism as a religion can dive into the objects of ritual that Jewish communities all over the world use. We welcome everyone here at the museum, whether they're Southern and Jewish, Southern, none of those combinations. So in addition to focusing on how Jewish ritual objects are used, we're also thinking about how these ritual objects have their own lives and experiences and meanings in a Southern Jewish context. In this gallery, hanging above us are stained glass windows. They are replicas of windows, of 50 windows from 18 congregations across the Southern United States. They come from all spans of movement, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, and they allow us to think about about the art that adorns our holiest of places. So some of these windows are representational. They tell us of trees, of Jewish stars, of menorahs, and others are abstract. They represent stories of the Torah, key Jewish concepts. This room is tiled, and so it kind of creates a roller coaster effect. But instead, I invite everybody to take a look at the tallis that I have just popped up on the PowerPoint. This is a tallis, or a prayer shawl, and it's on loan to the museum from the Lamb and Zora family. The cotton used to make this tallis was grown on the family's farm in Cary, Mississippi. The family has been growing cotton at on that farm since 1913. So when the family has a need for it, a bar mitzvah, a wedding, etc., it goes back to the family to be used. And this reminds us that objects in museums can and should be used in a cultural context. They don't necessarily have to be static behind glass. A tallis, however beautiful, however unique, it was intended to be used to wrap someone in prayer. So when we have objects like this in a museum collection, it's critical to keep those cultural uses at the forefront of our minds. And this is just another little opportunity to get our minds flowing. We also have a digital interactive where you can test your knowledge of Yiddish. Many museum visitors are very surprised to learn how much of Yiddish they already know. So just like earlier, that back and forth Jeopardy feeling, feel free to yell your answers at your computer screen or your tablet screen. So fill in the blank. You're not going out in those pants. I can see your a bubby, be shtick, die tuchas. If you said see tuchas, you are correct. Our next one, he never has solutions. All he can do is oive, fetch, Gornich. All he can do is a, oive, beak fetch, Gornich. If you said beak fetch, you are correct. And finally, I had to blank the children from soccer to ballet to the library. Is it schlepp, beak mamla, fel? If you said a schlepp, you're correct. I hope you got 100% on that quiz. And if not, come on down to the museum and we have even more of these wonderful Yiddish words that perhaps you know just because of your use in this context. I'm now going to roll us back into time as we step out of time as we do Foundations of Judaism into the 20th century. We're entering a new era. Let me make sure that's actually in frame. Great. So as we enter the 20th century, we think about the experiences that Jewish Southerners had that matched the struggles and triumphs of their neighbors and fellow Americans. World War I, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression on a national and international landscape, and the impact of the boll weevil on the Southern economy. The boll weevil was a beetle that feeds on cotton buds and flowers, and in 1920 infested all of the U.S. cotton growing areas, devastating industry and people working in the American South. And it deeply impacted the migration out of the South. Perhaps you've heard of it, call it today the Great Migration of African Americans. And in the museum, we talk about these stories about ways that Southern Jews were impacted by the Great Migration and other important landmark cases at this point. But I'm noticing that we have a light out. I need to turn that on. Oops. We focus specifically on two stories or two eras at the museum. I always tell folks that we would not be a Jewish museum if we did not talk deeply about the Holocaust, of how the Holocaust impacted Southern Jews and how Southern Jews interacted with this story, and also as World War II, and then civil rights and activism. We would not be a Southern museum if we did not talk about the ways that Southern Jews interacted with this incredibly important story that happened here in the American South. And right outside these twin galleries, we have this image of Ernst Berinsky and his students. Ernst Berinsky was a German Jewish professor, and he fled Germany in 1937. And though he was qualified to get a job at any university across the US, he faced anti-Semitism and hiring practices in higher education. However, he was welcomed at Tougaloo College, where he taught for many years. In fact, he donated his collection of papers as research to Tougaloo. And we don't know exactly the conversation that Ernst and his students were having when this image was taken, but we can empathize with perhaps the way they viewed their home. Ernst Berinsky fled Nazi Germany because of his Jewish identity, and his students lived in the Jim Crow South, were getting an education in the Jim Crow South, in a place where they were viewed as second-class citizens. And so that shared communication surely impacted the the ways that Perinsky and his students interacted. And it really highlights that shared connection between the Holocaust and civil rights stories. I'm going to roll us into our Holocaust gallery. Oh, went too far. In our Holocaust gallery, we tell the story of the Holocaust from a Southern perspective of how Southern Jews served in the US military, how Southern Jews had families and loved ones in Eastern Europe. Before, during, and after the Holocaust, Jews escaped as refugees and survived. And so I'm going to, again, I got an internet is unstable, but hopefully it'll work. A short clip of Ann Levy, a Holocaust survivor who still is living in Louisiana. If it loads.
Did not.
Skip this now, and perhaps I'll send a link in that clip and shares on like to get onto a bus here in New Orleans, here in Louisiana, and see a little sign that says colors only. And she knew that as long as that little sign was there, even if there were people who were much older than she was, much more in need of that seat, she couldn't sit down. And so she talks about that in her oral history that I'll share with y'all. It is on YouTube. And it's an incredibly powerful story. We also tell the story of we also tell a story through papers, through documents. I was preparing these virtual story programs and I walked through the galleries with our founding curator, Anna, and she shared something super beautiful with you that I wanted to share today with me that I wanted to share with you. So she called this exhibit space, Documenting Immigration, a love letter to the archives. In sharing the ways that archives are such fantastic sources of information from our past that not only tell us about what is written on paper that we have in archives, but the feelings that's conveyed when we keep that paper with us. So we don't lose stories when we keep our archives closed. So let me tell you the story of the Dante family of Dumas, Arkansas. So Charles Dante worked to get his two nephews out of Europe during the Holocaust. And he did this with the support of the Dumas Chamber of Commerce, who vows for Charles' financial and moral standing. He had to do a lot of work to try to get these two nephews out. And this was not a unique thing that Dante did. Many Southern Jews, many American Jews worked tirelessly to get their families out of Europe. Dante was unfortunately unsuccessful in getting his two nephews out of Poland. They both perished. One was killed at Auschwitz while the other died in a bombing raid. But we do not lose their stories because we still have these archival materials that are so important to not only the Dante family, but to the way we understand history today. They spark these stories, they get retold through documents, and it's so critical for us to be able to share these stories. We're now moving into our civil rights gallery. Oops, too far. Where we talk about various perspectives the Southern Jews had of the civil rights era. Throughout this gallery, we see Jews who were openly supported segregation, while others worked actively for equal rights, and many others sat silently on the sidelines of history. Some of their interactives in this gallery are never before heard perspectives of rabbis serving in Southern communities. So I hope that you come on down and take a listen. They're also recorded in a book called To Stand Aside or Stand Alone. And hear about what these Southern Jewish leaders were doing in their communities where Jews were actively targeted by racist groups. And they had community members who were actively segregationist. So in just the little bit of time I have left, I want to share my favorite piece we have here at the museum, or my favorite objects. So these are letters. They are written to the rabbi of Congregation Beth Israel in Meridian, Mississippi. It was bombed in the early morning hours of May 28th, 1968, because of the community and the rabbi's connection with civil rights. So these are letters of support written by local children who attend Catholic school. And I love these for a few reasons. First, we see a general support of the Jewish community. We hear from children what they were thinking of and trying to be supportive at the time. When I bring young folks in through our galleries, we stop here and we talk about how we care for our objects. You may be able to tell these letters written 1968 are in really fantastic condition. They look like they could have been pulled out of a folder today, and it tells us of how we care for our objects when they have such an impact. And how these young people had such agency to support the rabbi. And then I'm going to roll to more object, and then I have the benefit of doing a part 2 next week, so you'll have to wait for part 2 because for the last 2 stories I was going to tell. But I want to take this full circle with Anne Levy. So Anne Levy, who I told you a little bit about her feelings of having to get onto a bus when there's a sign that said for colored only, as a Holocaust survivor, her activism doesn't stop there. She, in 1991, stood up to David Duke, who was a longtime leader, a radical right extremist, and was running for the governorship of Louisiana. Duke was a Holocaust denier, and so Levy used her own experiences as a child Holocaust survivor to confront Duke during his run. Despite winning 55% of the state's white vote, Duke did not become the governor of the state of Louisiana. So while I do have a little bit more, I think that we have the benefit of next week to get us through. So I'm going to switch my camera around. We've come to, I think, a decent stopping point. So I'd like to take this opportunity to open up for questions. I also apologize and hope that my video didn't go in and out too much with my internet.
Hi, Lizzie. Thank you. Thank you again for such an engaging tour and showing all these wonderful objects and images. So we really appreciate it. And for those of you with questions, feel free to go ahead and send them in now. We have a few to get us started. The first question, just broadly, if you want to say more about how the museum defines the South.
Yeah, absolutely. So we cover a 13-state region, up to Virginia, not including West Virginia, not including Maryland, and down to Florida, the entire Florida. So, some people make a joke that the further south you go in Florida, the more north you are. We cover that region. There's historic reasons we've chosen that particular. We inherited our 13-state region previous iteration. I love when folks come in and they try to make a case, well, Maryland's really part of the South, or why there's West Virginia, or Oklahoma really is at the South. That's just how we define it. There's a lot to be said and a lot to argue, very Jewishly to argue about what constitutes the Southern region. So folks can also send me an email if they disagree. I love it, disagree.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I also heard that Maryland has a museum, and Baltimore and Washington D.C. now has a museum. So there's a few other spots that are, depending on how the definition goes, the South that have their own museums. But
absolutely.
Are there any Jewish customs or foods that are unique to the American South?
Um, so interesting, such an interesting question. I think that there are, um, you hear a lot. We have an intro video, and the thing that comes into my head is a gentleman whose name is escaping me, who says that his family served fried chicken and cornbread the night before Seder, and then chicken and matzo ball soup, brisket and matzo ball soup the night of Seder, right? So we have these shared traditions. There is some like Southern and Jewish food. So, for instance, here in New Orleans, we just finished Mardi Gras carnival season, and the kind of hallmark of the food of that is a king cake. So we're here who make like king cake. It's a very similar dough. And so we'll decorate a challah looking like a king cake with icing. It's icing or sanding sugar and purple and green, the colors of Mardi Gras, the colors of Carnival. Have a lot of well. Across there are other groups that like iterate their local food. There's Louisiana own food culture, so we have like a local kosher restaurant who makes a rib away. I think it's made of cod, right? So we have dishes, food, Jewish
We're
food.
losing you. I feel we lost your voice there a little bit. I don't know if there's a better
Oh,
spot that you jump to that gets a better signal.
maybe I decided to hotspot my phone, but let me go closer to a window and maybe that'll help. Sorry.
Okay.
Where'd you lose me, or is there a different question that I should answer? Sorry about
Uh,
that.
yeah, that we lost some of the story about the food. That's probably the
Uh,
second of it.
Um, so I was saying that we have challah king cake here in New Orleans, this innovation of a king cake for Mardi Gras season and challah dough. And then there are also other foods across the region that innovate Southern and Jewish. But if anybody on this call has a family member or a story of that, please connect us because we know a lot about what's happening here in Louisiana, and we're working to also make sure we know the food, um, creative food, Jewish and Southern foods in the rest of the region.
Great. Thank you. What does the museum say about the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and the Jews?
Interesting. We have a very little bit on Abraham Lincoln. We talk about General Orders number, I want to say 58, but numbers are not my specialty. So fact check me if you'd like. But essentially, the general orders that evicted the Jews from the Confederacy, that Grant put in, Lincoln then immediately rescinded that. That's what we talk about in the museum is how Lincoln rescinded the general order, that anti-Semitic order that Grant put in. But other than that, we don't talk a whole lot about Lincoln connection to Southern Jewry. If people know a bigger connection of Lincoln to Southern Jewry, please let us know. But as far as I know, I think that's the like big unique thing is that Lincoln took away the general order.
Great, thank you. A couple of you noted that it's General Order number 11. So
11. I don't know where I got 58. Maybe it wasn't in 58. I don't know where I came up with 58. Thanks, y'all.
no worries. Um, Another question here: Were the early? I know you mentioned this a little bit, but if you want to say more, were the early Jews Sephardic or Ashkenazi?
So those early colonial Jews, by and large, were Sephardic. They were coming over. Actually, they were probably already in the Caribbean, and then they just popped over to the American South. Um, and that's the same trend nationally, right? Those early Jewish settlers, both in the North and South, were Sephardic. But just like in the North and the rest of the country, we see a much larger population increase with Ashkenazi Jews in the mid 1800s, late 1800s, and early 1900s. But yeah, mostly folks coming from who had already left Spain and Portugal, coming back to England, West Indies.
Thanks. Moving now to more of the civil rights period, were the majority of Southern Jewish rabbis willing to speak out in favor of civil rights and racial justice from the pulpit? Or if you,
Yes, that is so. I should say yes, and we talk a lot about reform rabbis. The reform movement really took hold in the American South. And so a lot of the rabbis, there were other rabbis that were not part of the reform community who were speaking out on civil rights. But a lot of these rabbis who were on Southern pulpits were not necessarily Southerners. And so they came in with a perspective of equal rights, right? Um, and so this is also documented in a book called To Stand Aside or Stand Alone. And so they faced a lot of issues within their own community. Being a Southern Jew during the civil rights movement was still a time where identity was really complicated. A lot of Southern Jews whose family had been in the region for multiple generations um, had been actively fighting to be viewed as white. They wanted to be part of this like dominant culture. They were highly assimilated. They felt like they were part of their community. And while a lot of them held um, sympathetic views to the African American community, they were not very interested in being on the front lines. These rabbis, however, were, right? They're spiritual workers. They're people who are trying to think a lot about how to make the world a better place. And so these rabbis would go and they would march, and that created some issues within their community. They had community members who were very supportive of them. They had community members who were really angry that they had a rabbi who was putting, in their view, their lives in danger. They wanted to be part of this white society, but they weren't. They were still Jewish. And so they had worked a long time to try to assimilate that value. And so you get people like Rabbi Perry Nussbaum, Jackson, Mississippi, who described himself as a lone wolf, who felt like he was alone doing this work in Jackson, which really was a hub of the civil rights movement. Who were working around raising funds, hosting drives, whatever, for civil rights, but they weren't necessarily walking on the front lines like some of the rabbis were.
thank you. It's been a while since I've studied it, but I remember one of the people that Martin Luther King was responding to in the letter from a Birmingham jail was a rabbi, in response to them. They wanted Martin Luther King Jr. to slow things down, and he was then writing a response to it. So I get that was more in the case of a rabbi who was, I guess not. I don't know the whole history. They're not against it, but clearly not wanting to be on the front lines of the activism at that time.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Um, I'm taking a look here. There's a couple of people who have mentioned their own Southern Jewish history and are wanting to know if the museum has information that they could find on their particular family, or how to find out more information about it. One person is notes Shreveport, Louisiana, and another in Kentucky.
Awesome. Yes. So it's totally possible that we have your family story here at the museum. And it's also completely possible that we can connect you to other organizations that do have your family's history. So we recently opened our Chapman Family Research Center, which is a place where we have our on-site archives, but also is an opportunity to do family research. So if you have a specific question, feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the screen, lizzie@msje.org. I'll then forward your email to our curator, who has a lot more knowledge. But we're still a pretty small place, right? We're a few galleries and a small archive, and our goal is to be a connector, to know where some of these small Jewish archives are held. So in the case of Kentucky, I happen to know we don't have a whole lot of Kentucky, though we're actively collecting. But we can connect you to places like the Filson Historical Society in Kentucky that do have a lot of Southern or Kentucky Jewish history. And so that's also kind of our goal. And then there are other places. We're here to connect. So feel free to reach out to me or visit us on our website, msje.org, because we have a lot of great resources there as well.
Great, thank you. And then as a follow-up to that, is there a book you might recommend on Southern Jewish history?
Ooh,
This person
great
writes,
question.
yeah, fiction,
Um,
nonfiction, they noted.
Fiction or nonfiction? Well, I can do fiction
Yeah.
actually. It's a I mean, I can do a lot, but the book that I think of that I really adore, I'm also very interested in the Civil War era. But so frequently women's stories are left out of the Civil War era. So a book that um, dramatizes a Jewish and Southern connection is this book called The Thread Collectors. It was co-authored by Shauna Edwards and uh, another person who's really fantastic. Um, and it details the dramatized story of two women during the civil rights era or civil war era. And then in terms of Southern Jewish history, there's so many good books. I'm really excited to read. I don't think it's come out quite yet. I think it's coming out in April. The Jewish South by Sherry Rabin. It's the newest history book that's not out yet, but I'm really excited to read it. Um, so, but we also, I'll just plug our museum store. We also have a museum store where we sell a bunch of really great Southern Jewish books, both fiction and nonfiction.
Great, thank you. Yeah, a couple of people chimed in. I can see on the thing. One also mentioned the Sherry Rabin, and um, another one mentioned that a friend gave them the Jews of New Orleans in Mississippi. So we can share these resources in our follow-up email with you all. So
Awesome.
and what I guess another, I don't know if you have this knowledge, or maybe it's there at the museum, but what is the current Southern Jewish population outside the large cities? Are there
We do have that information at the museum, and it's at our front desk because a lot of museum guests ask that question. Unfortunately, it's not like directly in my head. I know about I want to say 12% of American Jewry lives in the American South. Um, and then we have a New Orleans stat too. Unfortunately, I'm not. Well, I said general numbers 58, not 11. I'm not great with numbers. I'm sorry, y'all.
No worries. We can
But I think it might be on our website.
yeah, we can put a link to your website, or if you have materials, we can also send those out. Um, Someone asked a question about if you know anything about Alice Henny, or want to say more about Alice Henny, who was married to Prince Albert the First of Monaco. Do you have stories about that?
I don't. Can that name again? I'll do my research because that is never heard that. So there was a Southern Jew who became royalty, I'm assuming.
That's what it sounds like. I'm also not familiar with this story,
Um,
but we
so
can.
no, but if you happen to know anything, whoever asked that question, feel free to reach out to me. This is the first time hearing of it, and that's the beauty of Southern Jewish history. There's so much of it and so much of it left to uncover. Um, but I will say we are not necessarily a museum of like famous Southern Jews. If we were a museum of famous Southern Jews, we would be over relatively fast.
And with I'll ask one final question for this time, and then we'll have plenty of time next time also to ask questions. But somebody here just asked about coming to the museum itself. How long should one
Yeah.
have time for, and is there a restaurant and cafe, or if you want to say a little more about the sort of logistics of the museum as we close.
Yeah, absolutely. Come on down to the museum. We're located in New Orleans Art District. We're really close to the National World War II Museum if people are familiar with New Orleans. So we're right in the hub of everything popular. We do not have an on-site cafe, but boy, do we have great restaurants in New Orleans and all around us. So come to our front desk and give us some recommendations. It takes about an hour and a half to go through the museum fully. It always depends. We say if you're a skimmer, a swimmer, or a sinker. If you're a skimmer, you can walk through our galleries relatively fast. If you're a sinker, you're going to read everything 3 hours. But on average, an hour, hour and a half. And if you're planning a tour, I recommend coming after April 10th because we are opening our new special exhibition called Most Fortunate Unfortunates, the Jewish Orphans Home of New Orleans. And that's going to be a really fantastic exhibit. So, I mean, if you're going to be here in the next month, please come. But otherwise, plan your visit for to see that special exhibition, which is on our third floor, along with our Chapman Family Research Center, where people can also start their genealogical journey. More information about visiting can be found on our website, but we certainly invite you to come down. If you are planning on coming down or you're just interested in learning more about the museum, please consider becoming a member. We are located in New Orleans, but we don't just do programs for New Orleanians. We have newsletters and programs that are streamed live streamed and are a great opportunity to keep your Southern Jewish head interested. So consider becoming a member. And then if you're a member and you come to visit, your visit's free. So.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we're looking forward to next week, and I've seen some different comments come in. A lot of people are looking forward to learning with you again. So
Yeah,
thank you for
next week.
that session.
We'll dive further in. I'm really excited to get to
Yeah.
share more, and hopefully my internet will be better.
Yeah, no worries. But I see some clapping hands going by. So thank you again, and thank you all for joining us. We look forward to having you again next week. So take care.